Good morning and welcome to HP2. The sequel is always worse. This is the only in-person edition of this talk, so thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy it. Have you ever seen something that was so complex it just had to be hackable if only you had time to understand it? HTTP2 is a beautiful beast, but it is complex, and where there's complexity, people take shortcuts and things go wrong. In this session, I'll show how you can use new features in H2 for a range of high-impact attacks, and also how those shed light on a type of request smuggling that has always existed but never really been noticed. Complexity causes trouble for me too. I first looked at the HTTP2 spec way back in 2019 during my H2.TE Desync attacks research. And I loaded up the spec, looked at the size of the browser scroll bar, and proceeded to skim read it so fast that I didn't even read the security considerations. My next encounter with H2 was after I presented that research at Black Hat USA. A member of the audience said, did those techniques work against HTTP2? And my answer was no, it's completely secure against that kind of thing. And my third encounter was later that night at a party in Vegas somewhere. Someone basically just walked up to me and told me exactly how you could actually hack things running HTTP2 with that style of technique. And what they explained to me sounded really promising, but I just spent 9 months exploiting request smuggling and desync attacks, and I really didn't want to be doing any more at that moment, so instead I went off and spent a year doing web cache poisoning. When I came back though, I tried this technique out and it really worked. I could hack all kinds of interesting systems. There was just one fly in the ointment, and that was Bitbucket. Every heuristic that I tried indicated that Bitbucket should be vulnerable, but every actual exploit I tried reliably failed. And normally when I encounter something like this, I'll spend a couple of days on it, maybe a couple of weeks, and then give up, cut my losses, and move on to researching something else. But I'd seen a scenario that was almost identical to this during my original request smuggling research, and I really didn't want to let it escape me a second time. So I kept coming back to this month after month, and eventually, in January, I found proper evidence that Bitbucket genuinely was vulnerable, but I still couldn't actually do any real damage with this technique. It was definitely vulnerable, but there was no realistic exploit path. Other than that, though, things with this research were going really well until March, when Emil published the research that he'd been doing at the same time as me on the same topic. And this meant that my presentation was at risk of just not containing anything very groundbreaking. I really needed to find something new fast. So naturally, I went back to Bitbucket again. And this time, I finally cracked it. And this led to a cascade of findings, including a new, more powerful type of desynchronization technique, an entire class of issue that was formerly useless becoming exploitable, Atlassian having to log everyone out of Jira worldwide, which was quite fun to monitor on Twitter, and Atlassian getting the computer emergency response team involved and awarding me triple their maximum bounty. So out of that mess, I've managed to extract some information that I hope you'll find really quite useful. I'm not going to try and explain this in chronological order because looking back at it, it doesn't make much sense even to me. Instead, first, I'll show how you can use HTTP2 for request smuggling. Then I'll focus on request tunneling and show practical techniques to confirm and exploit it. Then I'll cover some other kind of miscellaneous HTTP2 techniques and some practical considerations, and then wrap up with 5 minutes of questions. Although HTTP2 is complex, there's only 4 key things that you need to understand in order to effectively use the attacks shown in this presentation. So let's get started. What you can see here is an identical request represented in HTTP1 and HTTP2. The first key difference is that whereas HTTP1 has the request line containing the method and the path, HTTP2 instead has pseudo headers, which just look like normal headers, but they start with a colon. The second difference is that HB1 is a plain text protocol. So, for example, if you look at it on the wire with Wireshark or TCP dump, you can actually read it. And also, that means from a server's point of view, parsing HTTP requests is done with string operations like looking for new lines, and that's why it tends to fall apart generally when you attack it. HB2, meanwhile, is a binary protocol using fixed offsets and such like, more like, say, TCP. And if you look at it on the wire, it just looks like binary junk. And so what I'm showing you whenever I represent a HB2 request on a slide is just a human-readable abstraction of it. So for example, pseudo-headers aren't actually ASCII strings that start with a colon. They're actually mapped in the RFC to predefined bytes. The third difference is the way the two protocols tell the server what the length of a message is. With HTTP1, you need the content length or the transfer encoding header that hopefully you're familiar with, whereas in HB2, you don't need either of those because the length of the message is built in at the frame layer. So it's not shown on these slides because it's at a slightly lower level, but it's basically impossible to send a HB2 message that is genuinely ambiguous about what the length of it is. And that's why I thought request smuggling against HB2 was impossible. The fourth and final key difference is the way the two protocols handle multiple requests sent over a single connection. On HB1, it's terrible. You open your TCP socket and you just whack the requests down the socket one after the other, and you just read them back in order. And you use the order that the responses come back to work out which responses match to which requests, and that is going to become quite significant later on. Whereas in HB2, they have this concept of a stream ID, which is basically a label on every request that lets the browser and the server correlate requests and responses and means they don't necessarily have to be sent back in order. So, now we understand HB2, let's see what damage we can do. As usual, all the targets in this section are real websites that had bug bounty programs. I found all these vulnerabilities with the automated tool HTTP Request Smuggler that I have released. And of any bounties earned, 50% have been donated to local charities by my company, and the other half are going to be spent on beer. And if you see that squiggle icon at the bottom, that means that there's a live online replica of that vulnerability on our website that you can spin up for free and practice this hacking technique for yourself, just to get familiar with it in a safe environment that won't affect any real people. So, why is request smuggling possible against HB2? Because the majority of servers that speak HB2 to clients are actually rewriting these HB2 requests as HTTP1 and then forwarding them to the backend server. This behavior, which I call HTTP downgrading, is ridiculously common. In fact, on some front-end servers, you can't even disable this. It's not even possible to use HTTP2 end-to-end. What HTTP downgrading does is it basically dodges all the security benefits that you should be getting from using HTTP2. In fact, it arguably makes things worse because with classic request smuggling, it happens because the front end or the back end normally disagree about whether to use the content length header or the transfer encoding header to know the length of the message. But if you're doing HTTP2 downgrading, well, the backend doesn't know the HTTP2 message length. That information isn't directly accessible to it, so it has to rely on this translation step that the front end does. And if that sounds like a bit of a mess, that's because it is. If you take your front end and you turn on HTTP2 support via downgrading, you've basically doubled the number of ways that you may be vulnerable to request smuggling. So, let's start with a really simple case study. The HTTP2 RFC says, although the content length header is not required in HTTP2 because of the frame length, you're actually allowed to send the content length header provided it's correct. And Netflix used the front end which forgot to verify that the content length was correct. So when they did downgrading, the backend would interpret the resulting request as 1.5 messages, and the data shown in orange would be appended to the start of the next user's request to hit that website. And here I've crafted the orange data so it will trigger that user to get redirected to my website. So by sending that in real time, I could redirect random requests and with a bit of luck, redirect some JavaScript imports and gain persistent control of other live Netflix users' accounts, stealing passwords and credit card details and the like. For that, I got a 20K bounty off Netflix, which was nice, and they also tracked the root cause of this vulnerability back to the Netty Java library. After that motivating start, let's move on to something teeny bit more complex. The HB2 RFC, it's pretty good in general, but sometimes it doesn't really explain the consequences of things. So they say any message containing connection-specific header fields must be treated as malformed. And maybe that doesn't sound super serious, and Amazon's application load balancer ignored that line of the RFC. What did that mean? Well, here we've got oaths, law enforcement, backdoor portal thing, and they're using application load balancer, and one connection-specific header field is transfer encoding chunked. So they've downgraded this request, which should have been rejected as malformed, and once again, the backend has become desynchronized, and I've appended some data to the next request shown in orange, which once again triggers a redirect to my server. When I reported this, they said, well, it's just a redirect, what damage can it do? And I was like, are you asking me to exploit some live users? And they were like, yes. So I was like, fantastic, and I did. And what I found was I kept redirecting people who were in the middle of OAuth login flows and were thereby leaking OAuth codes via the referrer header. For that, I got 7K off Oath. This technique also worked on everything using the Imperva Cloud Web Application Firewall, which is supposed to make websites more secure. On another site, this was another Oath target. I could once again use the same technique thanks to application load balancer to trigger redirect to my server. And here, when I redirected people, I saw something else. People kept sending requests to my website that basically said, hey there, can I have permission to send you my password? So I was like, okay, sure. I wrote up some code and I said, yeah, go ahead, send me your credentials, please. And they did. And I've got a brilliant video taken with TCP dump showing a stream of credentials being sent to my server in real time, which I really wanted to share, but it's impossible to redact. So yeah, and for that I got 10K off Oath once again. That was the basic stuff, hopefully all fairly familiar stuff if you're familiar with request smuggling. Now things are going to get a bit more HTTP too. One cool thing about H2 is that it's a binary protocol, and as part of that, it lets you put arbitrary characters wherever you like and relies on an extra layer of server logic to say things like, actually, no, you shouldn't put that character in that location. So Firefox's start page was powered by the Netlify CDN, and they forgot to say that you can't put new lines in HTTP header values. This is something which is impossible in HTTP1. And thanks to that, we've got the request header injection vulnerability that I'm exploiting here to trigger request smuggling and smuggle a malicious prefix. Here, because there's a CDN, by changing my prefix to have my own host header, I could make requests to Firefox's start page, serve content from my own site on the Netlify CDN, and also Netlify would cache that and thereby serve it up persistently. So effectively, I got full persistent control over every page on every website using the Netlify CDN. And for that, I got 2K off Mozilla and 2K off Netlify. Now, when I tried the same technique on Atlassian's Jira, something unexpected happened. I was expecting to see two different responses coming back. The normal one and the poison one. The text is probably pretty small, but you can probably see we're not getting two responses coming back. we're getting a huge range of responses, which I've had to redact because they're clearly coming from different Jira deployments. They're intended for different people, and they contain a huge amount of sensitive information. And I had no idea why that happened. And eventually, I was able to figure out what the issue was. Because I could put new lines in headers, I decided to try and put my malicious prefix entirely inside the foo header instead of putting it in the body, just because it kind of seemed easier. And I forgot that when a front end does downgrading, it's going to put a couple of new lines on the end of the headers. So in my head, I was sending 1.5 requests to the back end, but I was actually sending exactly 2 requests. And when you do that, something slightly special happens. So I got the response to the first request. The response to the second smuggled one went to the next user, but then, because it perfectly lined up, that user's response went to the next user, and so on. So this didn't just send incorrect responses to me, it sent random authenticated responses to everybody. And thanks to the set cookie header, this was effectively logging random people into random accounts worldwide. And I didn't realize this, and I gave this POC to the security team, and they were running it without realizing it. And then they realized it, and that's why they had to log everyone out of Jira. This technique, as we saw, it worked on Netlify. It worked on Jira because they were using the Pulse Secure Virtual Traffic Manager front end. You might have heard of Pulse Secure. It also worked on F5's Big IP load balancer, and it also predictably worked on the Imperva web application firewall, even after they'd fixed the previous issue. The disclosure of that last one was slightly messy, because when they fixed the previous issue, they didn't actually tell me that they'd fixed it. So when I reported this to them several months before my presentation at Blackout USA, they didn't reply, and I didn't really think anything of it. And then the day before my presentation, I checked back and they were still vulnerable. So I had to get in contact with them quite urgently, but fortunately they were able to deploy a WAF rule using their own WAF to patch their WAF and thereby secure their customers. While waiting for the Pulse Secure proper fix to this issue, Atlassian tried out a few hot fixes on Jira. And it kind of shows some of the things that some of the variants of these issues that you can find. So one issue with it was they were filtering header names, but they weren't filtering new lines in header. Sorry, they were filtering values, but not names. And by itself, you can't do that much with that, but by also putting colons in header names, you can make that practically exploitable and trigger request smuggling. Also, they were filtering names and values by this point, but they forgot to filter pseudo headers, causing request line injection, which could once again cause request smuggling. And finally, in the path pseudo header only, they blocked the /r/n sequence, but they didn't block /n by itself, which is still sufficient for successful exploitation. So there, in summary, we've seen a range of techniques that you can use to exploit HB2 downgrades and achieve request smuggling. Now, we're going to take a look at something less flashy and less obvious, but still quite dangerous. When you find a request smuggling vulnerability, the possible attacks that you have available that will actually work are affected by how the front end decides whether to reuse an existing connection with the back-end server or to create a new one. Normally, there's some kind of shared connection pool and you can exploit random users just fine. But sometimes you'll find that you can only affect requests coming from your own IP. And when you see that, that's because the front end is mapping it's creating one connection to the back-end server per client IP. But that scenario is not that inconvenient because it's still exploitable via cache poisoning and you can still leak internal headers. And maybe if you use a VPN, you can exploit everyone else using the VPN and so on. What Bitbucket had was the most extreme scenario, where they create a new connection to the backend for every single request. They never ever reuse connections to the backend. And what I'm going to show you is how to prove this issue really exists and some new exploit paths that let you enable header theft and cache poisoning to basically make this a practical, useful issue. Let's visualize what happens here. So here we're targeting Bitbucket or someone like that, and you can see we've successfully smuggled 1.5 requests to the back end. But because the front end is never going to reuse this socket, it's just being discarded, and the data shown in orange is effectively being discarded by the back end or the front end, and the request shown in green, the victim, is completely unaffected by whatever we've tried to do. This happens naturally on some server setups, and it's also deliberately triggered by Amazon's HTTP Desync Guardian whenever it sees a suspicious request. I should mention that it didn't regard my HTTP2 attacks as being suspicious. So this causes a bunch of problems. The first one is with confirming that there is really a vulnerability present, because although the classic timeout-based technique that you can use to find request smuggling still detects this vulnerability, the normal confirmation strategy of sending a bunch of requests and confirming that earlier requests affect later ones doesn't work. So it's easy to mistake this for a false positive report. You might think it's quite easy to detect, just smuggle a complete request and see if you get 2 responses. But the response that you can see here doesn't actually show that this target is really vulnerable, because that's how HTTP 1.1 pipelining works. So what that tells you is maybe they're vulnerable, maybe they're not. It's actually basically a useless piece of information. Fortunately, HTTP2 fixes this. With HTTP2, if you trigger request tunneling and smuggle a whole request, then you'll see a HTTP 1.1 headers nested inside the body of the HTTP2 response, clearly proving that they are vulnerable to request tunneling. The next problem is that request tunneling is often blind, which means you can't see the second response. The reason for that is that the front end often looks at the content-length header that it's received from the back end, and it only reads that many bytes off the socket before passing the response onto you. And that means you can trigger 2 responses, but you won't actually see the second one, and this is what Bitbucket had. I found a solution to this problem by accident. I think sometimes you can make up for not really knowing what you're doing just by spending a huge amount of time on something, and that's what happened here. So I was hitting loads of endpoints on Bitbucket, and one of these endpoints was serving some massive file download. And the file download was so big that when I hit it in burp repeater, every time it rendered, it made the whole of burp lag. And it was getting on my nerves. So I thought, you know what, I actually don't need the response body. So why don't I just switch the method to head? And as soon as I changed the method to head, I started seeing 2 responses coming back. That's because their front end hadn't special cased head, and the back end had still served a content length, even though it wasn't actually intending to serve a body, because when you receive a head request, you don't serve a body. So the front end had overread into the nested response from the back end and sent it on to me. So you can often use this technique to make request tunneling non-blind. The only catch is that typically this is based on some kind of race condition scenario, so you may have to try this a bunch of times, and if your nested request is for a response that takes longer for the backend to generate, then this will be less likely to work. So let's say you've confirmed your request tunneling. How can you exploit it? Well, obviously you can't attack other users because connections are not being reused, but you can tunnel internal headers, which are often used by front ends to do critical site functions such as informing the backend who you're logged in as. But to exploit those, you need to know what they're called. And normal header leaking techniques don't work with request tunneling. However, if you can inject new lines in headers, thanks to HTTP2, you can cause a different kind of desynchronization that lets you find out. Normal request smuggling confuses the front end and the back end. It makes the front end and the back end disagree about where the body of the message ends. But by putting new lines in headers, you can cause a different kind of desynchronization, which makes the front end and the back end disagree about where the body of the message starts. So by doing this here, I've effectively led to the front end putting the internal headers on what it thinks is the end of the headers, but what the back end is going to treat as part of this S parameter, which is just the search parameter on the WordPress backend of this part of Bitbucket. So WordPress is going to tell me what I searched for, right? And it's going to leak all the internal headers in the process. And I found by hitting different endpoints, like non-WordPress ones, it would leak different internal headers, including some with secret keys. For a full end-to-end case study of exploiting systems with internal headers, check out the New Relic example from my previous HTTP Desync attacks research. Finally, if the stars are aligned, you might be able to use tunneling for cache poisoning. So if they've got a cache and the head technique works and the CLF technique works, this is worth a try. So what this lets you do, what the head technique lets you do, is mix and match response headers and response bodies. So here I've chosen an initial set of response headers that are just from the 404 page and set a content type of text/HTML. And then for my nested request, I've specified a different endpoint that just does a redirect that puts my query string into the location header without encoding it. And by itself, that redirect is completely harmless because the location header is not supposed to get rendered as HTML. But by sticking those extra headers on the front, I've effectively made that get rendered and I've gained arbitrary JavaScript execution. And thanks to their cache, I've got that saved and gained persistent control over every page on their site. And for that, plus the Jira issue we saw earlier, I got triple their max bounty of 15K, taking the total earned in this research to 56 grand. Now, I'm going to have a tour of some HTTP2 odds and ends that you might find useful. In HTTP1, you can send duplicate headers, and this is the basis of quite a few different types of attack. But you can't send duplicate paths because there's only one request line. But HTTP2 introduced pseudo headers, so that means you can send duplicate paths on some servers, and I've verified there are real servers out there. They do support duplicate paths, and they vary in which path they use as the real path of the message. So that could lead to some pretty nice access control bypasses. And similarly, HTTP2 introduced this :authority pseudo header, which is basically a replacement for the host header, but they didn't say that you can't also send the host header, so you can send some really ambiguous and confusing messages with H2 that may enable some interesting host header attacks. They also introduced the :scheme pseudo header, which, in my opinion, was a mistake. The value of this pseudo header, it's meant to be HTTP or HTTPS, but you can put whatever you like in it, right? It's a binary protocol, and often developers just trust this value, and so they use it for things like building URLs. So I was able to use this to get some cache poisoning on Netlify. Admittedly, it wasn't very high impact. And on a different target, they were using it to build a URL that they would route the request to. So you could use this for a limited type of server-side request forgery. On another site, I found I could put colons in HTTP header names, but I couldn't put new lines in there. And this still enables request smuggling as long as the backend tolerates this trailing colon that you can't get rid of in the transfer encoding header. If the backend doesn't like that, then your next best option is probably doing a host header attack because you're expected to have colons in the host header. On one site, I found, yep, I could use this to trigger request smuggling. And I got halfway through exploitation, and then I can't remember what happened, but I got distracted by something else. And when I came back, the vulnerability had disappeared, and the server version was reporting that they'd updated Apache to the latest version. So I thought, oh, this must be a patched Apache vulnerability. But I couldn't find any advisory for it. So I thought, I'll just install the old version. Maybe they accidentally patched it. Maybe I can use it for a demo or something. And I installed it, and I couldn't replicate it. I have no idea what was going on then, but because I'd installed it, I did accidentally find a different vulnerability, which was a 0-day in Apache. It also worked on the latest version. You could put spaces in the method pseudo header. And so as long as the backend server tolerated trailing junk in the request line, which some of them sadly do, you could use this to do things like bypass block rules on front-end servers and generally dance around security restrictions implemented on the front end. I reported that to Apache, and they fixed it in 2.4.49. You might have heard of that version. I would not recommend installing it. I'd go for a later version if I were you. Finally, a few practicalities. So one thing about HTTP2 is it uses the same port as HTTP1, and thereby a browser needs to be told which protocol it should use. So what the server is supposed to do is declare that it supports HTTP2 during the TLS handshake. But some servers support HTTP2 and forget to declare it. So that means if you take a casual glance at these websites, you'll think they don't support HTTP2 and you'll miss out on all kinds of valuable attack surface. But the good news is it's really easy to detect this. You just try and send a HTTP2 request regardless. And you can do that with the extension that I've shared. Burp Scanner will do it for you, and you can also do it just with curl using these command line flags. I found a site that had that behavior and was vulnerable to HTTP2-based request smuggling, but there was a catch there, which was I could only exploit other people that were using HTTP2, which was nobody because they weren't advertising support for it. The tooling situation is also a bit of a mess. Basically, existing tooling doesn't work because libraries will refuse to send the kind of malformed requests that we need to send for these attacks. And HTTP 1.1 had that issue too, but you could fall back to using things like Netcat and OpenSSL. But because HTTP2 is a binary protocol, that's wildly impractical. So instead, you need to use Emil's tool, HTTP2 Smuggle, Turbo Intruder, which I've made a custom open source HTTP2 stack for, or you can use Turbo Intruder with Burp's HTTP2 stack, which is slower but more reliable, or Burp, just core Burp, or the HTTP request smuggler that I've released. If you don't like Burp, please take note, you can use Turbo Intruder as a command line tool. It doesn't actually depend on Burp. As far as defense goes, I think the most important thing is I would advise network architect type people not to use HTTP2 downgrading ever. I would not turn on HTTP2 on your front-end server until you can have HTTP2 end-to-end. It's just too dangerous. Beyond that, though, if you're a server vendor, I'd recommend enforcing HTTP 1.1 limitations, like the RFC tells you, like not letting people put colons in header names or new lines in silly places. And for developers, I think over time, you'll probably want to drop the assumptions that used to be valid in the world of HTTP1. For example, it used to be safe to put a HTTP header in an email header because email headers are terminated by the same thing that terminates HTTP headers. But thanks to HTTP2, that's no longer true. And at one point in time, that would have led to an unauthorized remote code execution in WordPress, I believe. But not anymore. Don't worry about that. And also the other thing is don't trust the scheme pseudo header. This is 100% user input. It's just not safe. There's a whole bunch of further reading available. The main thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is predictably our Web Security Academy, where we have more explanations of these techniques in a greater level of depth and also interactive labs, so you can try them out for yourself. But the other stuff is there's some useful post-exploitation stuff there too. And the three key things to take away are that HTTP2 breaks assumptions at multiple different layers of the stack. HTTP2 downgrades are just really hazardous, and request tunneling, in spite of being a massive pain, is a genuine threat. I'm going to take 5 minutes of questions now. If you have any more after that, feel free to come up and chat to me at the back or chuck me an email. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter. Thank you for listening.